One of the guys that I got introduced to was Dennis Hopper. And Dennis Hopper was in the movie business. So through him, I got involved in the movie business. And so Dennis introduced me to people at Paramount Pictures, and I started teaching Mike Connors, who was doing Mannix. So because of that, I started doing choreography. I was probably one of the earliest guys, other than Ed Parker, who did choreography. Gene LaBelle, myself, and Ed Parker were probably the three guys that were the earliest to start doing choreography for movies and TV. So I did that for many years, and that, and through that I started teaching a lot of people in that business. One of the problems was that in 1970, the Hollywood business changed because everybody started going off to Canada, to this place, because we had it cheaper. But now watch the difference. If he does the same thing and I go rotating my body, it's going to be twice as effective. Why? Because my body momentum is going to have the power. And then when I would deliver my next technique, I'm already in a position to do this. He comes in, if I go 1, 2, it's not going to be anywhere near effective as 1, and then driving in. So one of the things that I really believe in is using the whole body.
Sensei Farkas, could you tell us something about your history, please?
Well, it's history. I started martial arts actually in Hungary, and it was a weird reason for that. What had happened is that I was a little kid, like typically, bullied by many, the older kids, but I was a great runner, and I could run like a rabbit. And then one day, I slipped. 3 of the guys caught up, beat me up, and I decided, the hell, I got to learn to do something about it. That particular year in Hungary, one of the, world's great boxers won Hungarian boxer won the Olympics. So boxing was a very big craze. So I decided 2 weeks right after the beating, I said, I'm going to go take boxing lessons. So in Hungary, they have a lot of these, what they call sports clubs, where they teach boxing, wrestling, judo, not judo, but fencing, all their soccer, all the various sports. So I got on the streetcar, went over there, and I was going to walk up this and take boxing lessons. And on my way to the boxing gym, all of a sudden, I hear a noise in the corridor, all this noise going boom, boom, boom. Couldn't believe what it was. I opened the door, and I remember I'm an 8.5-year-old kid, and I look in, there's a bunch of guys in white pajamas throwing each other around. I looked, I said, whoa, what the hell is that? I sat down, I watched this thing, had no idea, because such a thing as martial arts in Hungary didn't exist at that time. So I sat there till they finished, and when they were walking out, one of the guys came over and wanted to know what I was. I said, I was going to take boxing lessons, but I love this stuff. This is great. What is it? So he explained to me that it was judo. It was a brand new sport just coming into Hungary. He wore a black belt, I noticed, and he said that he's one of the instructors. I said, what'd you learn? He happened to be a chauffeur to the Hungarian ambassador to Japan. And when he was in Japan for 2 years, he learned it. Anyway, but unfortunately didn't teach kids. So I was disappointed. I said, well, can I come and watch? So I sat and watched. And after about the 5th time, he got sort of nice. And he said, after class, come on over and I'll show you a few things. And that's how the whole thing started. He started showing me, and all the adults, some of the adults had kids. So they bought their kids. And before we know it, we had a kids class. And so I started learning judo. Actually, I started about 8.5. But unfortunately, what had happened is I was practicing for about 9 months. The Hungarian Revolution broke out. So all of a sudden, my parents came home one day and said, you know what? Pack up everything. We're leaving. I said, we're leaving good. I said, don't ask questions, I'm going. So we went to a border town, carried my little suitcase. My parents carried my brother and sister. And we spent 8 hours walking across the border, middle of December, with border guards chasing us and all that. So anyway, we got to Austria. And we stayed in Austria for about a few months and managed to come over to Canada.
What were some of the most memorable aspects of fleeing Hungary during that time? Did you see or experience?
Oh, it's terrible. Well, I'll give you a perfect example. What happened to me? I was a kid, to me everybody was bombing, and So we used to go down to the cellar to get coal, so every second they would go down to the cellar. So one day when we went down to the cellar, my father was talking to some of the neighbors, so I snuck out. I go down the street, and I see a man hanging from a lamppost. What had happened is that the revolutionaries grabbed all the secret police people and hung him for the fastest. I ran back and I started crying. I was like shook. And so it was a powerful thing, and 5 doors down, we saw Sherman tanks coming down, or whatever tanks they were, Russian tanks, blowing up buildings. So it was very dramatic, and one of the things is that I'm told is that, when you're that young, you grow up very quickly. And then we escaped to Austria. I didn't speak the language. We had to stay in a concentration camp for probably 3 months. Then we moved to Canada. Of course, I didn't speak the language again. So, it was very traumatic.
Please do tell us about getting to Canada and getting involved with the martial arts in Canada.
Well, what had happened is this. Moved to Canada. Fortunately, my mother had somebody that she knew there, so they put us up for a while. And after about a few months, one of the few things that I did was judo. Is that I started going to school, and one of the things that I want to do is get back into the martial arts, and there happened to be a YMHA near where we lived. So I went in there one day and found that they had a judo club, actually run by very famous judo people from out of England. So I joined the judo club there and started training in judo, and so I got back into it. And what had happened is that we would oftentimes go over to Frank Hatashita's dojo, who was the most famous judo guy in Toronto, and train there. And one afternoon, Hatashita announced that next weekend there was going to be a karate demonstration. Nobody knew what karate was in those days. And so we went over there, and that was the first time I saw Master Tsuroka. So Tsuroka came over there and did a big demo, breaking and doing all these crazy things. I said, wow. Because you got to remember, I got into the martial arts because of the fact that I want to fight back. In other words, to me, it was a self-defense mechanism. It wasn't a sport. It wasn't anything else. I wanted to make sure that these things never happened to me again. And when I saw them breaking bricks and doing all these other things, I said, whoa, this is what I got to do. So while I was doing judo, I got on the streetcar. He had a dojo in Queen Street up on top of a bowling alley. I walked in there. I must have been, I think, 14 or 13. Anyway, I walked in, and there was a bunch of guys in white uniforms punching and kicking. And within 2 weeks, I joined Tsuroka's dojo. And that's how I got involved with him. So I trained with him for 3.5 years, got my brown belt. And then another incident happened. What happened is my mother fell down one day walking home because Toronto is very, it's cold. And she slipped on the ice and ended up with a slip disc. And the doctor said to her, he says, look, you're going to suffer. The only chance you've got is if you go to a warmer climate. So luckily, my parents knew somebody here in LA, and so my father said, hey, we got to move again. And I remember it was a funny thing because, I've already moved once. So the last thing I wanted to do was move again until the karate people pointed out that the best karate people were all in Los Angeles, both judo and karate-wise. So now I got all excited. Now I'm going to move someplace so I can do that. So we rooted up again, and we came to LA. And, I got back into school, and one of the first things I did was, find a karate school. I found a place not that far. Unfortunately, LA was different than Toronto. The advantage in Toronto was you had streetcars, and you could get almost anywhere. With LA, it was much more difficult. Buses only went certain places, whatever. So I had to find a dojo. I got lucky. I found a Japanese dojo called the Tokyo Karate Federation, about a few miles away. So I joined that place and continued training there. And within a few weeks, I also found a judo club, also in Hawaii, and continued training there. And one of the interesting things about it was when I first walked into the dojo at the Y, at our dojo in the Y, we had maybe 4 or 5 black belts. Here, you had a dozen black belts, and some of them were 4th and 5th degrees. Yeah. So I was in martial arts heaven, and so that's how I got involved in the martial arts. So, I continued training, graduated high school, went to university, and that was my beginning in the martial arts. But one of the things that, that I've always focused on was always martial arts as a form of combat. Although it was very competitive and I did compete to a large degree, but never to the point where I enjoyed that. To me, I think competition took away some of that, and so I always focused in on the combative elements. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is Patrick McCarthy, who's going to assist me, a longtime friend and a very well-known martial artist. One of the things that I like to demonstrate, for example, is one of the things that I specialize in, what I call combat Shokan, which means is that learning how to use your body, full body. I'll give you an example what I mean by that. All I want is, for example, Patrick does a lunge punch on me, and I'm going to block here, okay? The block is going to be effective, but now watch the difference. If he does the same thing and I go rotating my body, it's going to be twice as effective. Why? Because my body momentum is going to have the power. And then when I deliver my next technique, I'm already in a position to do this. So if I did, watch, from here, he comes in, if I go 1, 2, it's not going to be anywhere near effective as 1, and then driving in. So one of the things that I really believe in is using the whole body. For example, in Shokan we learn upward block. But the reality is, how many people in the street are going to come and punch you in the face? What are they going to do? They're going to take a big swinging punch. Oof, makes a lot more sense. So what we do in my dojo, a lot of practice on forearm blocks. Because a forearm block is going to be effective, then follow with an elbow. Now, most people in a traditional dojo always learn, block, and then you punch, which is fine. But if you're going to be blocking and you're a small person, you're going to get a lot more out of an elbow than you're ever going to get out of a punch. Because an elbow is a solid bone. So one of the things we repeat over and over again, you move in, you to jam your opponent so there's no strength, follow up with a solid elbow. I really emphasize elbows, especially because I teach a lot of women, and women always get in close up. So when you're close up, what better technique than elbows? For example, someone grabs you around the neck. This is nice and dandy, but 9 out of 10 times, you're not going to be able to get that thing out of your hands. What do you need it for? An instant strike to the nose is going to be much more effective. Same thing, someone grabs you, drive it into his nose. Finish it off with a knee kick. Practical, traditional, and yet very, very effective. Someone grabs you from around the waist. Try to go down and do all these silly things from here. Solid elbow to the face, solid strike to the groin is going to be much more effective than, for example, someone grabs you, trying to twist yourself out of it, put him in an arm lock and do all these silly things that are really not practical unless you're 3 times as big as your attacker. So these are the kind of things that I specialize in.
Well, everybody who knows you knows that you are literally a walking encyclopedia of American karate history. Certainly this year is the 50th anniversary of running the Beverly Hills Karate Studio. Please, talk to us about that. Tell us something about the Hollywood scene.
I'll tell you how that happened. I was training at it's an interesting thing. I was training at the Tokyo Karate Federation, and there was a very famous record producer called Phil Spector, whom I never heard of. I was not into rock and roll. I was a European. I was into mostly classical music, gypsy music, and that kind of stuff. So rock and roll to me was an unknown quantity. Anyway, one day, the chief instructor at the dojo came over to me and says, listen, I know you're going to college in the mornings, but I have a student that is interested in some bodyguard work. You're one of the lead, you're one of the higher ranking students here. By then I had a black belt. He says, would you be interested? And he said his name was Phil Spector, which didn't mean anything to me. So there was another Hungarian there who also was a black belt. So the two of us decided to take the job. So we went up to the house. It was gigantic, 35-room mansion. And we met this little short guy, with fancy suits and Benjamin Franklin cast, a weird-looking guy, with a big limousine. And the first day, we get into the limousine and we go over to this concert by James Brown. Never heard of James Brown, didn't know him from Adam. We go in there and the music was horrendous. Everybody loves James Brown. I couldn't stand it. But anyway, we stood behind him. We did the whole thing. I had no idea whom I was guarding. And this is a funny story. I actually believed that I misunderstood him and that we were watching some sort of inspector. That this guy was an undercover guy because I couldn't imagine anybody looking that weird and doing this whole getup. So for that whole week, I thought we were just working for an undercover guy. Anyway, we come back, he closes the door, says thank you, and we left. The next few days, I went over to the guy and I said, who is this character? So he gives me a magazine and I open it up and he says, The Tycoon of Teen. So apparently this guy was a 23-year-old richest mogul in the music business, and that's what we ended up working for.
That's
And what happened is that because of him, I ended up meeting almost everybody, every rock. Well, I'll give you the funniest story. The second day that I was with him, where did we end up going? We're going to the Troubadour. Now, I didn't know Troubadour from Schmoobadour. I didn't know anything. What I did know was that we walked in, and it was jam-packed with gorgeous-looking girls, guys with long hair. Everybody apparently was in the record business, and we're standing there, not doing anything. And 5 years later, I opened up right next door to the Troubadour. And of course, by that time, I knew that everybody was famous, ended up going over there. So, and what had happened is that Phil was a very weird guy. He didn't really need bodyguards. The whole point for the bodyguards was, you had lots of money, you have the big house, you have the big car, and what's the next? Well, I've got bodyguards. So it made him stand out. Didn't really need anything, but he was a weird guy because oftentimes he would pick on people. So we had our share of, of difficulties. Well, I won't get into that. But anyway, what he did do was very nice, is that he introduced me to all these people in the record business. One of his big pack, every time he had a party and people would come over, well, do a kick, do a demonstration, break a board, whatever. So it gave me an access to a lot of people. One of the first guys I started teaching was Brian Wilson. Of the, I'll tell you another funny story about that. Brian said to me, would you come over to the house and give me a private lesson? I said, sure, why not? So I go over and give him a private lesson. Next day when I saw Phil, he said, did you teach Brian? I said, yeah. He says, what do you pay you? He says, $20. He says, what are you, nuts? He says, you go back there and tell him it's $75 an hour. I said, Phil, nobody pays that. To me, that was like I was a 19-year-old kid. I said, just tell him $75. This is an introductory lesson. So I go over next day, and I figured that was it. That was the last lesson. So he said, no problem. Writes me out a check for $750 for the next 10 lessons.
Wow.
So I realized that money was no object to these characters.
Can you tell the time frames in which we're speaking? Could you please explain to the viewers who Brian is?
Well, Brian Wilson was the head of the Beach Boys. You don't get any more bigger than that. So through Brian, I got involved with lots of producers. One of my next big clients was Herb Alpert. Herb Alpert studied with me for 5 years. And he's a Tijuana brass. He's big. And I had Gary Lewis and the Playboys. I had Paul Williams, from, famous songwriters. So I had myriads of people in I had the Buffalo Springfield were students of mine. So I had myriads of people in the recording business. And what happened to Phil, one of the guys that I got introduced to was Dennis Hopper. And Dennis Hopper was in the movie business. So through him, I got involved in the movie business. And so Dennis introduced me to people at Paramount Pictures, and I started teaching Mike Connors, who was doing Mannix. So because of that, I started doing choreography. I was probably one of the earliest guys, other than Ed Parker, who did choreography. Gene LaBelle, myself, and Ed Parker were probably the three guys that were the earliest to start doing choreography for movies and TV. So I did that for many years. And that, and through that, I started teaching a lot of people in that business. One of the problems was that 1970, the Hollywood business changed because everybody started going off to Canada, to this place, because we had it cheaper. So my choice was either stay in town or go off to Vancouver or wherever they were filming, and I just didn't want to do that. So that was the reason I opened up the school. I liked teaching. I thought I was very good at it. So one day when I was driving right next to the Troubadour, which I knew by that time very well, somebody was subleasing the place. I walked in. Guy said, $300. I said, I'll take it. In January 1970, I opened the doors. And because of the fact that it was next to the Troubadour, I started getting a lot of people in the entertainment business. I got producers, directors, And so it sort of worked itself out. As a matter of fact, I even told you, one day, Elvis Presley sat down there. It's a funny story, because, usually people would walk in and sit there, and I was teaching classes. And, and you usually look over and, continue. And then one day, it can't be. He's sitting right there, watching the class. So I finished class, walked over, we ended up 2 hours talking. He was studying with Ed Parker at that time. He was very interested in Shakan, which he didn't do. And then he walked out. He went next door to Troubadour.
Everybody's been in that dojo. Bruce Lee, tell us about Bruce
Everybody, But I'll tell you the Bruce Lee story. Anyway, so what had happened is that a year later, he happened to be opening up in Las Vegas, and I get an invitation in the mail, to come and see his show. Very nice guy. Anyway, so that was, and because of one of my students happened to be Joe Himes, and Joe Himes was studying with Bruce Lee. So Joe and I would go over to Joe's house and watch Bruce teach. So that's how I got to meet Bruce. I'll tell you a funny story about that. The first time I ever met Bruce, shook my hand. He says, "Are you quick?" I said, "I think I'm pretty quick." So he says, puts a quarter in my hand, and he says, "Okay, I'm going to try and grab that quarter out of your hand." He says, "You think you can close it quickly?" Go. So you still got the money? He says, "Yeah." Open up. It was a dime.
Oh, he took it.
So he switched it up. So that was my introduction to Bruce.
Incredible.
Anyway, so that, and then that 1970, I continued, opening the dojo. In the meantime, I continued training. And, but before, it was interesting, because before I opened the dojo, I had spent 2 years with Nishiyama. I had went to Japan 3 times to study. And when I opened the dojo, I continued going, twice a year to Japan to continue training at the JKA. And one of the things that was so interesting about the whole thing is that, which I noticed, nobody cared. All they wanted to do was learn karate, whether you were doing Shotokan or, it wasn't important. What was important is the fact that you got good training. And so that's when I started training. And then the rest is history. Traditional Shotokan sidekick. What is fine. One, side edge of the foot, kicks, nice. And the reason that they do it is because originally the object was to kick someone right underneath the armpit. But if the exact distance isn't correct, your knee's gonna snap. Same side kick. Solid, flat of the foot. Never gonna break my ankle. One of the things I learned and teach, never kick here. Knee. That's gonna be the most effective. Much more effective than trying to kick someone and drive in there. Same technique, drive it in. So I emphasize, kick low, don't kick high. It's nice to be able to boom, but what are you gonna do that on the street? Unnecessary. If I'm gonna hit somebody, one of the things, don't move. Nice punch, but what's gonna happen? If you're an average person, you hit the jaw, good chance you're gonna break your knuckles. My attitude is, same punch, never gonna break knuckles, lots of power, you're gonna do the job. So my rule at my dojo is, body, use the fist. You're not gonna break your knuckles because you got soft. Above the neck, use the palm. So I don't teach punches to the face with the knuckle because it doesn't make any sense. You're just going to hurt yourself. Still traditional. It doesn't really matter if you throw a punch this way or if you throw a punch this way. The end result is the same. The only difference is much less chance of getting hurt. And I also emphasize keep it basic. It's nice to do fancy stuff. But when is the next time going to go wham with a spinning back kick? It's nice to know. And I think it's great for balance, for coordination, timing. Does it have any practical application on the street? Could, but it's silly. You're turning your back. If you take a guy like Patrick, and he's coming at me slowly, and I kick, and the minute he hits me, I'm going to go flying, because my timing is going to be off. So why spend an enormous amount of time on something that has no value? He comes into me, why turn? Simple front kick. Minute he doubles over, I got an elbow to his face. So I emphasize basic technique, but with the practical application.
I've got to ask you one question.
Ask me one question.
Perhaps it's a little bit off the beaten track for this particular topic, but as a historian myself, I was fascinated listening to you describe the actual introduction of karate here in the United States. Would you mind talking about that?
Very interesting. I had many years ago, I became friendly with a guy named Mel Bruno. Mel Bruno, a lot of people don't know that name, but Mel Bruno was probably was at one time the highest ranking judo instructor in America. In 1948, he became the physical and martial arts instructor for the Strategic Air Command. So in 1949 and 1950, he went to the generals and he said, listen, I want to take a bunch of guys, one of the physical fitness instructors, and I want to do a 20-week course in Japan where we're going to train in all the different various martial arts, and then hopefully bring that back and start doing that for the military as a combative course. Now, one of Mel's strengths was he was an incredibly capable man in putting concepts together. In other words, he could take the concept of the training, exactly what you had to do, what skills you needed, so on and so forth. So it was very organized. So the generals agreed to that. Now, Mel was very was well known in judo, and he knew all the judo people because he knew Kotani Sensei and all the Kodokan people, but he had no concept of karate. So he happened to have a friend of his in San Francisco, and he went to him and he said, listen, I need somebody in Japan who teaches karate. He says, no problem. Now, that particular person happened to train under Mabuni Sensei, Shitoryu. So he said, here's the address. When you get to Japan, look him up. So Mel took all these guys to Japan. Unfortunately, he couldn't find the address. So what had happened is that he took all these guys to the Kodokan. Now, the Kodokan was tied up with the JKA because the JKA originally used the old Kodokan as a training site after they moved to the new building. So they obviously pointed him to Funakoshi Sensei. So instead of Shitoryu, they ended up with Shotokan. So he ended up with Nakayama and Funakoshi Sensei, and all these guys got training there with Aikido, Judo, Jiu-Jitsu, so all the martial arts. But more than anything else, Mel became fascinated with karate. So he took all the Nishiyama, all these guys, he took a top of the top guys and brought them back to America and did 50 Air Force bases. That was really, people don't realize, that was really the first introduction of karate, traditional karate in America. Then when he went back to Japan, he went over to Nakayama. He said, Sensei, you got to let the world know about this. Nobody knows about karate. I mean, very few people. He said, never thought about it. So he says, I'm going to sit down with you and I'm going to organize it. I'm going to tell you exactly what you have to do. People don't know. He was the one that came up with the concept of, of organizing a JKA training class for instructors, what they call the instructors classes. You just can't send people out. He said you have to train them to teach. You You have to train them all sorts of things. You have to train them to be lingual. So everybody had to have a college degree. You have to train them in business. So he went through the whole thing, and he was the one that convinced Nakayama Sensei to start what they call the JKA teaching school, where they started sending out all the instructors all over the country. If it wasn't for him, it would never have happened. And because of the fact that it was Nakayama, all the instructors were Shotokan people instead of Shitoryu people, whoever else would have happened. So that's why Shotokan became so big in the United States and worldwide, only because of him.
What a fascinating
And
history.
nobody ever wrote up on that.
The question begs to be asked as well, because you are so well known for the functional competency of your combat Shotokan karate, whereas today the cultural recreation and the competitive element dotted with rules and regulations has perhaps created something different from the original idea. Could you talk a little bit about the combat nature of your Shotokan karate, and if even possible, something about Nakayama and Drager Sensei and their influence upon you?
Well, one of the things that I know, one of the things that I realized a long time ago, I'm small, so size wasn't my attribute, so the only thing that I realized is to be able to defeat someone on the street in a combative situation, you have to have power. And by that I mean body power, what we call body dynamics. Now, when I trained in Japan, one of the things I noticed is that, number one, most of the Japanese were relatively small, but constantly repetition of basics, and basics with lots of body. I mean, these guys would be devastating with their punches and kicks. Why? Because they learned how to use their whole body. So by learning to use your whole, Nakayama always said, the key to karate is the little things, not the big things. Anybody can learn to lift their knees up, but it's how you drive the body into the kick. It's how you twist the body at the same time as you're doing a block. So he was very adamant about that. So I used to think about the fact that, like, for example, we would spar. As much as we would spar, we would do 10 times as much basics. I mean, we would do 500 reverse punches, 500 kicks, side kicks, back kicks. So I realized that while competition is what made karate grow, it's the combative element that most people, especially where I was teaching, was seeking. Because that's really what people walk into. I don't care what anybody tells me. Nobody walks into a karate dojo at the beginning because they want to compete. They walk into a karate dojo because they want to learn self-defense. Now, later on, as they become good and they get inducted into that, all these other elements come into the fact. But that, to me, was the most important thing. Now, one thing I did learn in Japan, which I continue to this day, says I really, really loved the philosophical and the cultural aspects. So even though I teach a combative element, people still bow, people still kneel, people still do all the etiquette, because I think that that's part of the culture, and I think that that helps people get into the mind frame that it takes. The only difference between what I think, because I teach traditional Shotokan, the only difference is where my focus is. In other words, for example, I will do a lot more reps, and I don't mind. I'll give you the most interesting example, how I change, minor changes. A side kick. Almost everybody does a side kick with the side edge of the foot, right? Now, why the side edge of the foot? Do you have any idea why they do that?
Not at all.
Okay, you're a historian. Do you know why the side edge of the foot was taught? I'll tell you why. Because what happens is, in the old days, a lot of the people in Okinawa used to fight against samurais. And the samurais were dressed in armor. Well, you can kick somebody in armor and you're not going to break the armor. Now, where's the one place that the armor has an opening? You know what that is?
Sure, in the legs and the groin and
No.
the throat?
Underneath the arms. Because of the fact that when you lift the thing up, so you can't have armor because you can't move. So if you lift your foot up and you do a side kick, you notice a Japanese side kick is snaps out. It doesn't really drive as much. Why? Because they learn kick under the arm. But to kick flat of the foot under the arm is difficult, but a side, it goes right directly under the arm. So that kind of side kick really comes from that element, which is wonderful if that's what you're doing. But in real life, you're not going to kick under the arm. But if you do a side kick with the side edge of your foot and somebody jams it, what's going to happen to your feet? Your ankles are going to go. But if you kick with the flat of the foot, the power is still going to be there. But if someone jams it, worst comes to worst, the kick isn't going to be effective. But you're not going to break your ankle. So minor tweaks like that is what I started doing. But I kept all the basic elements, you know. I started, you know, bunkai is one of the big things in, you know, in Japanese karate. And I started to realize all the major senseis that I've studied under. Nakayama sensei did bunkai one way. Nishiyama sensei did bunkai another way. Third sensei, you know, so I started saying, doesn't make any sense. So rather than focusing so much on bunkai, I focus on the individual techniques. You know, that's what's important. Because if you do this, and then you do this, well, why not do something else afterwards? You know, it doesn't make any sense. So I teach the kata for different reasons. To me, kata is basically a great way of teaching balance, coordination, timing, rhythm, and all that. To make it practical, I can make it practical without the kata, because I can teach somebody how to do self-defense techniques without that. So those are the only differences that, you know, that I do in combat
Sensei,
Shotokan.
would you talk just a little bit, if you don't mind, about the dynamic karate between Nakayama when he featured Don Draeger?
Sure, but Nakayama Sensei was also, one of his interesting things was he was also very practical. And, you know, and so was Don Draeger. So I remember when, you know, in Japan, he grabbed Draeger and he said, you know, a lot of people want more practicality. It's not all about, you know, things. So he took all the basic Japanese Shotokan karate techniques and he formulated a whole combative thing. Matter of fact, he put together a whole series of books, you know, what he called, if you want to call it, Shotokan for the street. And he started showing how you don't have to take a guy and throw him over your shoulder, you know, how you use your elbow in a proper manner, how you use all these quote-unquote secretive techniques, you know, to defeat an opponent. So I have, you know, and I still to this day look at those things because I believe that he had the right element. Now, I'm going to say one more thing that's very interesting that a lot of people don't realize. If you take a look at Shotokan karate as it was studied under Funakoshi sensei versus the JKA, there's a big difference. And one of the big differences, you notice much deeper stances, much more dynamic motion than, for example, best example, if you take the training of Nakayama, Funakoshi, Kanazawa, all these people, versus the Shotokai, which was the original Shotokan, much softer. And you know why that happened? Very interesting. Because when Bruno took over all of these guys in 1951, what were these guys? All of these soldiers were 6'2", big, strong. None of these guys were little guys. And you know, and when the Japanese started doing these things, you know, they had a hard time with this guy throwing a punch and you just want to knock his hand over. The hand didn't move. All of a sudden, Nakama said, well, realize you got to make your body make the move. Because in the old days, you know, you just use your hands. Now, all of a sudden, they added elements. And they also realized to be able to push a bigger guy, you needed a bigger base on the bottom. If you were that high up and you threw a punch, your base didn't allow you to knock him over. So they lowered the stances for that reason, to be able to defeat a much larger, stronger opponent. So within 3 or 4 years, while Bruno was there, all of this has drastically changed because of that reason. Because they realized that you can't just keep fighting against the same size. And that's why, in my opinion, they really, you know, they were very organized. They went, you know, they did it scientifically. They figured out the angles, that if your foot was 1.5 feet farther back, the amount of power generated was going to go in. It was all scientifically done. And that's why modern Shotokan is what it is today, because of the things that happened with Mal Bruno.
And when you're looking at the contributions of that era and the experience that 50 years of teaching at the Beverly Hills Karate Academy has given you, is there a timeless message in there? Can you tell us about that?
Well, I think that, as I said, I really believe that most people walk into a dojo, they first want to learn martial arts for self-defense. And I think that if you focus in on that and you get them to realize that, yes, there is a self-defense element and you get them to stay, then all of a sudden you get more into the art. A lot of people, unfortunately, reverse that trend. You know, they go in there and they start basic, but without, why? I mean, I have many people come in and say, well, I've been studying karate for 6 months. I couldn't get out of a choke if my life depended on it. So I start everybody off on the element of teaching them these basics. And then I get them involved in the rest of martial arts because that is what it's all about. Now, the one thing I've learned in 50 years of teaching is that it isn't about the system. Everybody still marries Shotokan, Shito-ryu, Goju, whatever. A lot of that comes from competition, I feel. Because to a large degree, most karate has the same element. A punch is a punch, a kick is a kick. You may do it a little bit differently, a little bit of the same. Nowadays, because of, obviously what we have is, so much TV and whatever, everybody copies everything anyway. So it's a mixture. What has happened is, it's nice to stick to tradition, but you got to open your eyes. There's a lot out there. Now, I don't say that, one of the things I don't like is the fact that people try to study 5 different things at the same time, because that's silly. So get good with one thing, then learn something else. There's nothing wrong with learning judo, but if you're going to learn judo and karate at the same time, you're not going to learn either well. So get a black belt in karate, then go to judo. Get a black belt, then you'll have the best of both worlds. I did that. So that was one of the things that I've learned when I was, because I was doing both, and I think that you drive yourself crazy with that.
If there's any one message that this lifetime in the art of karate has provided you with, what would that message be, particularly for the youth of today in relationship for tomorrow?
Perseverance, never give up. One of the nice things about karate, which all the martial arts, which I thought was brilliant, is the fact that you go in and you see progress. You got a white belt, you got a yellow belt, you got this belt and that belt. And people start to realize that if you persevere, I mean, I have people in there who have no physical ability. And that's one of the reasons I love to teach, is that it's easy to teach a guy who's great, who's got coordination up the kazoo. But what happens to the guy who's uncoordinated? And all of a sudden, 6 months later, he can do things he never in his life thought about. And one of the things that it teaches you, that if you stick to something, you will reach that height. It doesn't have to be martial arts. It could be in business. It could be in anything. So I believe that that's something that most people get out of martial arts. And the second thing that I really believe is that it gives you confidence, not just physically, but mentally. Because if you believe that you're physically capable, then you start to believe that you're mentally capable. So that to me is something that I really believe that martial arts has to offer the public. Roundhouse kick. We all learned this. Guy comes in, you sidestep here, my Gary, roundhouse kick. It's a great kick, no question about it. Does it have any practical value on the street? Sure, it could, but why bother? Guy comes in, if you're already here, wham, lots of body. He doubles over. If you want to take him down, you can, etc. So that's how I structure my thing. It's all basics, it's all traditional, except for the fact that its focus is on practicality. Even when we do kata, rather than say, well, this is the bunkai for this. For example, guy throws a punch. 1, 2, 3, throw a punch with that. Okay? That's fine. Okay? So you do 1, break the elbow, hit the hand. That's the bunkai that you see in a lot of places. Nice. Now, would I ever sit down with my students and say, listen, if somebody tries to grab you, block his hand, break his elbow here, and then hit him in the face? I, as an instructor, would be negligent to say that to somebody because it feels stupid. If someone's going to grab me, I got to make sure that I happen to hit him right exactly on the elbow and follow through. When if I already blocked him, I'm in a much better position to directly go. So Do I teach the kata? Sure. I go 1, 2, 3. So why do I teach it? Because it's good for balance, and from back stance, coordinate 2 hands coming together and strike. Boom, boom, boom. Do I say to my students, well, no, this is the practical application of that? I says, no, because I find it to be unnecessary, not to really make any sense, so why bother doing it? That's basically how I structure my instruction. Traditional, yet in a very practical manner. I thank you.
We have known you as a writer, a historian. Your stories and your publications have captured the attention of an entire generation of enthusiasts. We have now heard rumors that you're going to take the history of karate, martial arts in America, and go online with it. What's that about?
Well, one of the things that I really believe in is that the old people get forgotten. I mean, if you walk up to the average good black belt and you say, you know who Nishiyama Sensei was? Never heard of him. And on and on and on. I mean, you go to the Martial Arts Museum, a lot of great people up there, but what happened to the people that really bought it to this at the beginning? They're not up there. The Peter Urbans, the people that, that started it many, many years ago. So I really believe, being a historian, that you can't forget the past, because that's important. So one of the things that I like to do is I want to start something called the American Martial Arts Historical Society. And that's my whole thing, is to take the history of American martial arts, put up photographs, and put up histories and biographies of people that really were instrumental in bringing this to the thing. I mean, 2 years ago, I did a book in which I took 2,000 historical pictures, and it covers the whole history of American martial arts from 1900 to the present. But as you know, in a book, only a few people see it. So I'd like to put up something there where anybody can go to it, get a feeling of who really were the old people, who were the people that were instrumental, what did they accomplish, what did they do to keep life, and because I'm a historian, I don't pick sides. I'll give you an interesting example. When me and John Corcoran started writing the Encyclopedia of Martial Arts, almost everybody, when they do any kind of reference book, they have their favorites. Well, this guy is this and this guy is that. I said to John, the only way I'm doing this thing is that we are absolutely straight. You don't have to like a guy. You don't have to believe in what he does. But if he's did something that is instrumental in furthering the martial arts in this country, he deserves to be mentioned. I'll bring it out because it doesn't matter now. Aaron Banks. Very controversial person. A lot of people disliked him because he was this, that. I said, you can't knock the fact that Aaron Banks accomplished more than almost anybody in the martial arts when he first started on the East Coast and the Oriental world of martial arts, put all these people on, gave them exposure. You got to put those kind of people in,
Exactly.
Because people don't know about that. Mel Bruno is another example. People don't know who Mel Bruno is. He was super instrumental. And I could name you a dozen people who nobody ever heard of who did more for the martial arts. One of my pet peeves, for example, is nobody ever gave Bruce Tegnay credit.
Exactly.
Bruce Tegnay, everybody disliked him. Now, you don't want to know some? Ed Parker and I had a talk about that. And he admitted to me, he says, 50% of the people that walked into his dojo walked in with a Bruce Tegnay book. And they were looking for a dojo. And that's why they came here. He said, I don't know Bruce Tegnay. I don't know why nobody likes him. But the fact remains that he was so instrumental. So he was historical. I remember when I first came to town, he was one of the first guys I looked up. Why? Because there was a book. So I knew his name. I went and talked to him. Do you know that Bruce Tegnay's parents, and people don't know about this thing, his mother in 1935 already had a judo black belt. They brought over the highest ranking judo guy, Sensei Kawasaki, to Chicago, opened up the Chicago Judo Dojo in 1936. And they had the largest judo club in Chicago at that time. He was literally born on the mat. It wasn't like he was young people, he's a phony, he doesn't know this, he doesn't know that.
There's a famous scene in Blood on the Sun with James Cagney in his 1937 film. Did they have something to do with that as well?
In that particular case, they didn't. But you know what? Bruce Stagney was teaching stars in the 1940s for martial arts movies. He was the first guy, but way before Ed Park and anybody else.
He had all the books.
Besides the books. I have pictures of him teaching famous movie stars on films. Errol Flynn, all sorts of people. Because the whole family was involved in that.
Right.
So now he may not have been a ninth degree black belt. He never claimed he was. But another thing, I'll give you a funny story. What's the big thing today in martial arts? Mixed martial arts, right? You mix this with that and whatever. And everybody says, who was the first guy that's been given credit for that?
All right, they give it the
To a large degree, everybody says it was Bruce Stagney. I mean, not Bruce Stagney, but
Lee.
Bruce Lee, because, he mixed Jeet Kune Do and he figured. But you don't want to know something? 1961, Bruce Stagney was teaching a system called Jukara. Put judo, aikido, and karate together. 651.
That's mixing martial arts.
Mixing martial arts. He mixed the stuff that he knew into a practical martial arts element. And I walked into his dojo in 1965 on Hollywood Boulevard, and he had, and I remember this because I walked, he must have had 120 people there training. They were learning break falls, they were learning practical stuff. He had a large following. Why? Because he realized a long time ago it wasn't about the system, it was what you were offering people. So people like that should be remembered. People like that should be given credit, which is why I wrote the books about them.
And how will people find your online program?
I haven't figured that one out yet, but we're working on that. Hopefully we'll promote it in some manner because I think it needs to be done. I think people, that's why I write, my books are mostly, tend to be historical or that kind, because everybody's done a how to do it book. You don't need that anymore. But I really believe that you can't forget, the old teachers. For example, you get any one of these people, let's take Sensei Nishiyama. Now that he's dead and nobody's training with him, people are going to remember what he did or didn't do, whether he did negative or positive things. But the fact remains that he was here, he bought it, he created a large following, and he trained people in it. And I think that needs to be remembered. And so that's one of my pet peeves is that, that we should educate, the upcoming students in that.
I couldn't agree more with you, Sensei Farkas, and I am remembering the Japanese koto waza or proverb or maxim of onko chishin. To study the past is to better understand the present with regards to the future. And if the expression tall trees provoke the pride of winds, then I am confident that our viewers on this interview will come to realize that you are most certainly one of the tall trees in the forest of the martial arts. And I would like to personally thank you for this opportunity to listen to you speak and to educate us all with regards to the fascinating history of martial arts in America.
Thank you.
My name is Fumio Demura. I come from Japan. And today I introduce you called Tsuno Tekko. Original Tekko made by horseshoes. Then from there, they create this way. called tsuno tekko, like a horn and tekko, like a brass knuckles. You hold the hand here and then striking, hooking, and pinching. That's why we use tekko. Now I show you next kata, tekko show. This is a little longer and a lot of stand up by one leg.
Tekko show! 举杆，看，嘿，呀！
So what we do with these drills is develop coordination, timing, exercise. That's why it's considered a skill drill. The thing that we don't like about these drills is that there's no give and take, right? So I'm not learning how to hit back, I'm just learning how to do this. And the big part of this is that in stress training, people like to go faster and they tighten up. They stop breathing and doing. The reality is that as far as I'm concerned, once I get to this point, I'm not practicing the drill. I'm practicing my mental and physiological state. I want to breathe easy, I want to relax, right? And I want to feel comfortable. The nice thing about this drill is that you can get a nice fluid pace. And it's a lot of pushing and pulling, so it teaches some basic clearing for someone who likes to defend. This scooping motion changes the energy, and I'm using his defense to do this. Because as a technique, what I can do here is, if I come through here and I'm monitoring here, and he goes this and he passes this through, right? Now I can use this to trip it. All of your mistakes amplify. So what we want to do is pare down the technique to be as fluid as possible, as clean as possible, and well-timed, right? That way, we'll be able to control ourselves under stress. This is not good. I can't use my tricep. He's divided me so he can conquer. I'm gonna unify by doing this. Go ahead and do it as much as you like now, right? And then I just drive through here, and I go for this reverse figure 4 here, right? And then I go for the head tilt. He pushes the head tilt off. He does it back to me, and I don't like that. So again, in the other lock blow or lock blow 2 where we did this, I just push off. I grab the top arm. So what you see is I'm grabbing here. This is the thumb that I'm grabbing, and then I'm just gonna step out as I do it. I'm just gonna go like this so that I can break this. So he's gonna go for the guillotine. I do that, and I go after that arm there. That prevents that.